Exactly 10 years ago today, I learned that my mom's cancer was rapidly regrowing in her brain after she had done 3 forms of treatment, each progressively more intense. So, first it was R-CHOP, and then it was followed by R-MPV with outpatient rice, and then finally an autologous stem cell transplant, which we had hoped would help her achieve a permanent remission. But that was not the case. After only a couple months after her stem cell transplant, she had already relapsed, and her oncologist let her know that there were no more traditional treatment options left for her to pursue. How I felt about this latest development in my mom's cancer journey is well documented in the days that I included for November 5th through 9th in my book, Losing Linda May, A Cancer Caregiving Memoir, so I'm not going to go over that in this video. Instead, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how cancer treatments are decided upon. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, especially not an oncologist, so keep that in mind as I'm going through all this. I am not an expert by any means. However, after having gone through cancer treatment myself and being a primary caregiver for my mom and reading a lot about cancer in between that time, including The Emperor of All Maladies, written by Dr. Mukherjee, which I highly recommend, I feel like I've gleaned a lot of knowledge about cancer and the treatments that are available currently. The key word there is currently, because cancer treatments are ever evolving. And part of the reason is that there are constantly experimental trials that are happening. So in the moment that I included for November 5th, my mom brings up the fact that her oncologist is looking into experimental trials for her. And I have a really bad knee-jerk reaction to that development because I was concerned that my mom would be treated like a lab rat and that she'd be subjected to all these horrors, and then she would ultimately end up dying anyway. Now that I'm much more aware about how everything works, I realize that yes, that is actually the case. People are treated like lab rats, but it's a necessary evil because that is how we have advancement in the field of treatment. So without clinical studies and experimental trials, we wouldn't know if a type of treatment is effective, or perhaps more so effective than current first-line treatments or refractory treatments and things like that. And that is also the way that we develop completely new treatments that might revolutionize the care for someone who has a disease. So they are very necessary. And a perfect example of that is actually ABVD, which is the first type of treatment that I received for my Hodgkin lymphoma, was developed in the 1970s as a potential alternative to the then first-line treatment called MOP, which was really hard on the body and very toxic and had a much higher likelihood of causing another type of cancer to form in the future. So when ABVD came along, initial studies suggested that it could actually be better than MOP and have the same result or even better, but then they had to go through the rigorous trials that were associated with making sure that it was safe for human use. And then finally, after they did all of that, they did prove that yes, ABVD was a better first-line option than MOP. And what I mean by first line is that this is the type of treatment that everyone who has Hodgkin lymphoma has to start out with. That is usually how it works with all cancers, where there is a dedicated first-line treatment that has been the most studied of all the options out there. And that is usually what the doctors will prescribe, and it's usually what the insurance companies will cover, because that's the thing. If a doctor starts throwing out all these different treatment options that are not studied, then the insurance is not going to cover them. Even if it's a good idea, they will always fall back on what is the most researched option and the most effective way to get someone into remission. That is just how our medical system works. By comparison, IGEV, the treatment that I received following my first relapse, so I went through the entire course of treatment for ABVD, all 6 months, and even though it's well studied to show that it can get individuals into remission, it wasn't successful for me. So then I had to turn to IGEV, which is considered a refractory treatment. So that means that if someone has relapsed, then you are eligible to do that type of treatment. It wasn't ever designed to be a first-line treatment. It was never supposed to be the thing that would replace ABVD. So that was developed in 1997, and it went through all the trial process between 1997 and 2005. So by comparison, ABVD was developed in the 70s. This is much more of a recent drug. And so for that reason, there is less research behind it. it, but it has been shown to be effective in individuals who have relapsed from Hodgkin lymphoma. Not every type of cancer has a Rolodex of treatment options though. Sometimes there is only just a first-line treatment option, and if that fails, they have to go to experimental trial, if there is even one. Sometimes you fail the first-line treatment and then you ultimately pass away from the disease because there's just nothing else out there. The reason for that is that usually researchers focus on the types of cancer that are most common. Obviously, there is a lot of research being done on things like lung cancer or breast cancer or testicular cancer because so many people are afflicted with those types of cancers. Whereas there's much more obscure types of cancers that don't get a lot of attention because so few people have them. Hodgkin lymphoma is actually the exception to the rule. So out of all the new cancer cases that are reported in the United States in a year, less than 1% are Hodgkin lymphoma. But despite that, it's been really well researched because earlier on in like the 1960s, when a lot of new treatments were being explored, they focused a lot on Hodgkin lymphoma for a couple reasons. One is that it straddles the line between a blood cancer and a solid cancer, like a tumor-based cancer, which is like breast cancer, versus blood cancer, which is like leukemia. Because the mutated cell, the Reed-Sternberg cell that is the defining factor of Hodgkin lymphoma, pools in lymph nodes and make them swollen so they are a physical mass on the body, it kind of demonstrated a similarity to things like breast cancer, but it was ultimately still a blood cancer. So a lot of the researchers were trying to see if the treatments for leukemia could then be applied to things like breast cancer. So that was one of the reasons why they focused on Hodgkin lymphoma a lot. Also, adolescents are much more likely of all the cancers to get Hodgkin lymphoma. So that is another reason why they put focus on it, because it was afflicting youth versus individuals who were in advanced age, like other types of cancer, where they had lived a full life already. So trying to figure out a treatment for them wasn't as vital or as much of a priority as something that afflicted the youth, similar to how they really focused on leukemia. If my cancer ever relapses and it is still Hodgkin lymphoma, I could go onto this holding drug that would basically allow me to live with cancer. It would never get me into a permanent remission again, but it would keep the cancer at bay and I could live pretty much a normal life. And so that is something that, due to all that research, due to all the experimental trials, is available to me because Hodgkin lymphoma is just so well researched. I didn't know any of this when I got the call from my mom on November 9th when she let me know that her oncologist had found an experimental trial being offered for her type of cancer at a research institute in New York City, and it was for a drug that was very much like that one that is available currently for Hodgkin lymphoma. So it's a holding drug. The drug would bind to the cancer cells in the brain and then prevent them from replicating so that she could ultimately live with cancer. I'm jumping the gun a little bit by sharing that information because I would learn it at the consultation a couple days later, so keep that in mind. In the meantime, on November 10th, I'll be releasing another video where I'll be talking about how even the most minute details and little things that you have to accomplish can feel so consequential when you are grappling with major news. So hit subscribe, leave any questions in the comments. The link to my book is in the description, and I will see you all on the 10th.